often. I'd like to introduce two of my colleagues who are also here. Cynthia Paris-Jeffries is our Assistant Superintendent for Elementary Education. Heather Richards is our Director of Human Resources, and both Cynthia and Heather will be involved in the search process. So just about goals for today, I really want to give you all a clear picture of the principal search process from start to finish, and even talk about, if we have a moment, about how we would make a new principal even successful, because part of making a new person successful is really having a positive search process. So we'll talk about that as well. I also want to make sure we have as many questions answered as possible. So I'm actually going to do this fairly quickly because I just know there are going to be questions. I've never done a certain meeting like this when there aren't questions. In particular, I think there will be questions here because Mason Rice has not done a principal search in 21 years. That's a really long time. I've been doing principal search processes for a long time, and there's only one other school that I've ever done a principal search process where the principal was there longer than 21 years. I did one elementary school when I was a superintendent in New York where the principal had been there 29 years. And I think some of the dynamics are similar. For example, virtually every teacher in that building had been hired by the principal who was leaving. And that was very powerful. Many of the staff, and I asked the Mason Rice staff this on Thursday, had never had another principal in their careers. And so that's a very different dynamic. In some cases, you had a couple of parents at the school who had kids who had been, he had been the principal of the parent and then the child. And so those are different kinds of searches. I can also say that the sense of loss and community loss can be significant as well. And we know that's the case with someone who has wonderful relationships over a generation, really more than a generation when you think about 21 years. So there's a lot to that, and kind of processing all of that. And that's always a factor in the search versus somebody who was not there as long, although we've done principal searches with principals who have been around 7 to 9 years, and there's still a real sense for somebody who's made a lot of contributions of loss and moving forward. So our job, is to work collectively to move the school forward and to build on the terrific work that Mark has done over 21 years. A colleague of mine always says that schools generally don't stay the same. They're either getting better or getting worse. And so our job still is to move, like any organization, move it forward, building on all the good work here. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the search process. Before I do, I thought it'd be helpful just to take a moment to think about, what makes an excellent principal? What do we look for? What does the research say? I look at the job kind of in a few components. It's a really complicated job. We always want to hire somebody who's an excellent educational leader. And we'll talk about during the process how we assess some of that. But in the olden days, I remember when I was in elementary school, my principal of the second elementary school I went to, his name was Mr. Means. And all I remember is him kind of being mean and sitting in the office, and the only student who ever saw the principal was the student who maybe had a discipline issue. I never remember Mr. Means talking about, with teachers. I doubt he worked with them on instruction and talked to them about social emotional development and the best practices in literacy. But the job has certainly changed so much since then, and we want somebody who really knows the latest research about teaching and learning and support teachers, understand changes, understand the context of Mason Rice, understand testing data, and have a sense of what it does and what it doesn't do. So the educational leadership is really important. The next part, we all know, is the principals need to be terrific managerial leaders, and you can't really focus on educational issues as a principal if the school isn't efficiently and well run. And that involves so much in terms of organization. When you think about a school now that almost has 400, close to 500 students, tremendous, work that needs to be done in hiring and management and schedules, student management, supporting a lot of adults. So there's that part of the job. And then the third part of the job, I really think, is the community building and relationships part of the job, and that includes building powerful relationships with internal people who work in the building, as well as in the community, as well as with the broader community of the Newton Public Schools, because these jobs at the end of the day, relationships, and Mark obviously talks about this a lot and models that for all of us, are so important as well. So that's just kind of, we can talk more about that later. And everyone has work to do in those components, but you want to hire somebody who is really skilled in those three areas. So why don't we go to a little bit about the process. This is going to be a thorough search process, and it's going to be an inclusive one that'll include multiple steps. So our job is to be thorough, be thoughtful, and yet move at a reasonable pace during the hiring season. It'll be a comprehensive search. Today, of course, in the old days, even old days, up till about 5 years ago, you would advertise in newspapers such as the Boston Globe, the print edition. You look at a Sunday Boston Globe and see all kinds of principal positions advertised. That has totally changed. I hope people are still advertising some in the Boston Globe. After seeing Spotlight last night, you can see that newspapers still have the potential to do incredible work in our society. But we advertise now online in many different sources. If you're an international school principal in Bangkok and you want to move back to Massachusetts, you can go on to School Spring and many other sites to find out that there are principal positions open in Newton. And so we're as comprehensive as possible. Most candidates will probably come from Eastern Massachusetts. People tend not to move for principalships unless there is personal reason, just because there are principalships all over the country. In terms of what we can expect from an applicant pool, they'll come from a few different positions. Number one, we'll have sitting principals apply. We filled a number of our positions with sitting principals who come here from other districts because they really want to work in a district like Newton. People love our size. The fact is, an elementary principal, you can have 14 other colleagues. It is wonderful in terms of working collaboratively, learning from other schools, sharing. We also have a lot of instructional curriculum support, and of course, support in scenarios of social emotional learning and mental health. So the applicant pool will be sitting principals. We'll probably get some assistant principals who apply, maybe some curriculum coordinators. Those are kind of where we'll have candidates come from. And in terms of how long we search until we think we have the right match and the right candidate. So usually we hire somebody off the first search, but I'm going to be at Newton North at 10 o'clock today because last year at Newton North we did not hire the 2 finalists. We have an interim principal that's working really well, and then we're starting even earlier this year, and we're gonna search again. That happened at Countryside a couple of years ago as well. We just didn't think we had the right match. We waited a year, and then we found the right person. And we do so because it's one of the most important decisions we make, and I make, is hiring leaders. Not only hiring leaders, but supporting leaders is equally important. I was talking to faculty about, as soon as we find the right person, our job immediately becomes, how do we make this person successful? And it's even more challenging for somebody to be successful when we've had a long-term leader that's been successful. We know that about leadership. So we'll have to think extra hard and be really thoughtful about, and we all have a stake in that, making the next principal successful. Okay, next, in terms of where we are in the selection process, so we've already started advertising for the position. This is our informational meeting with parents. We had the meeting with teachers last Thursday. Really good questions and information. And then there are two ways I'm going to talk to you how you all may be involved. Two ways. Number one is we have a selection advisory committee, which is the first round of interviews. That involves interviewing the first group of candidates. Usually it's 8 to 10 candidates we'll probably interview. Any more than 10 becomes too much. We also see, it's hard to find more than 10 candidates. You all have interviewed before. More than 10 is a challenge in general. And that there are multiple stakeholders, and that it involves faculty, it involves a principal from another school, another administrator in the curriculum or special education area. It will involve Cynthia, Heather. That's the first round, and that in the first round it's really about interviewing 8 to 10 candidates, and then saying, you know, there are maybe 4 that we could move forward to the semi-finalist round. Sometimes it's 3. It's about up to 5, where we say, you know, I don't know that this person's the best principal right now for Mason Rice, but let's take another look at him or her to see if there's potential there. So that group is moving forward candidates who I would describe it as a winnowing in process till the semifinal round. And that's the group right here. It's, they craft interview questions, choose the candidates, and they suggest, actually that should be semifinalists. And next, let's go back and take a look at the calendar if we could one more time. So that's the first meeting of the Selection Advisory Committee, and then the interviews are going to take place, let's see, February 1st and 2nd. Those are the dates. We have dates already. And then the semifinalists will be February 23rd and 25th, which I think is that's probably right after the February vacation that week. So the semifinalist round involves what I would say is more of an authentic look at the candidates. Those of you who have interviewed people know, and these are half-hour interviews, you get a glimpse into somebody in a half hour, but you know, we've interviewed candidates who answer questions very well, they're very well prepared, yet sometimes when we have them do authentic tasks, it doesn't match what they articulate in an interview. We also, you know, our teachers see that sometimes where somebody goes to a demonstration lesson and it doesn't match what they talked about in an interview. So this involves multiple facets, this semifinalist round. First of all, it's in a school, it's in another Newton Elementary school because the process is still confidential until they're finalists. So they will go to another Newton Elementary school and observe a range of classes, different grades, perhaps a co-taught class, learning center situation, all ELL, and then they'll be asked, what did you observe? What kinds of questions might you have for the teacher? What trends do you see in the school? And then we throw questions at them around, perhaps a question's dealing with conflict, perhaps it's a question about pacing change, perhaps it's a question about how they would handle a situation with a parent or a child. So there's a range of simulations in the semifinal round. And then we tend to winnow it down even more, typically. And then we move to the finalist stage. So by the end of February, we will have finalists. How many finalists? And that's the week of March 7th. Finalists, I would say we've had between 1 and 3. I would say in the last 6 years, we've only had 3 finalists I can think of twice out of maybe 8 or 9. And we've had, on occasion, at Countryside 2 years ago, we only had 1 finalist. And that was true at Franklin last year as well. Last year at Newton North, we had 2. So it really can, at Williams we've had 2, so that'll really range. And then those 2 finalists will spend a good chunk of the day at Mason Rice, where they'll get to meet with a range of stakeholders in different formats. So they'll begin the day just like I'm doing right now in this room. They'll probably talk for 3 or 4 minutes and then open it up to questions. And that assesses, you know, how they can work in a large group. How well do they listen? How well do they handle questions that I'm sure won't be simple? And then there's another role for parents in smaller groups, which is about 5 or 6 of you, to sit around the table with finalist candidates. It's very different sitting around the table with somebody than it is in an environment that we're in right now. And they'll do the same things with faculty. And then the question we can think of is, you know, how long do we want them to be here? And last year in the Newton North Finalist Day, we had the candidates in the building from about 7:20 to 6. That was their finalist day. This year, we talked about extending it where they would run with me at 5:30 in the morning. That's how they would start. And then any of you who have any, like, you know, serious circuit training at the end of the day, we want to see how they do. Because these are demanding jobs, and stamina is a part of, you know, being a leader. And so we can figure out how long you want to have them here. That's really up to all of you. So we'll figure that out along the way. So that's why I don't even put the schedule, because we do have some schools now that kind of want to do some stamina tests. You know, we have events here at Mason Rice at night. You got to be active. So that is it. And then we hope by you know, the week of March 7th to have this, if all goes to plan. Now, what can get in the way of this schedule? A couple things. Number one is snow days. So that can really sometimes throw us off. We have the finalist days. That happened last year. It happens. So, you know, somebody asked me, do you have to call snow days for finalists? I mean, we do still have to call snow days to make a decision. So that's a problem. Sometimes we'll have a finalist that's a finalist in 2 different searches, and that gets tricky. Do we move it up a couple of days? Because it's a competitive environment out there. That's something we'd have to weigh. But the goal is to finish early in March. So I am going to stop and just kind of open it up to questions. Go ahead.
So I might be alone in this thought, but I wanted to ask anyway. The one person, like you said, who's done all the hiring here, and he's done a great job.
I think we're going to go to microphones because this is being taped.
So the one person who's done a great job hiring at this school is Mark Springer. So when I think about finding one person to find the principal, I would want him to be involved. So I see there's one principal on your SAC. Can we change the rules and have him be involved?
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, I've gotten that question over the years about could we have the current principal involved, and I don't know a school or school district that has ever done that, and first I appreciate the question because Mark has done really well in hiring. Now, I will tell you this. If I'm applying for this job, and I already know that there's a principal who's been here 21 years that makes me nervous applying for the job, and then I know that he's also involved in the hiring, that can be very, very awkward. So the answer is, and Mark knows this, and he actually supports this, and I've talked to him about this, he won't be involved in the hiring at all. For a couple of reasons. We would never, having the principal involved, most of us who hire want to hire people like ourselves, and that puts Mark in a very awkward position, and candidates in a very awkward position. So there will be faculty certainly involved in the search, and parents and other administrators. And I know this can feel awkward to not have Mark involved, but you know, I honestly, in 4 school districts, I've never seen it or known it. Mark will certainly meet the finalist candidates to talk about the role, and certainly we want a candidate to learn from Mark in terms of the work he's done here, but in terms of having him involved in the selection, that won't happen. And that's also part of it, you know, in talking to Mark about it, and he wasn't involved in his previous school in the selection processes. It's also time for Mark to begin to back off and step away. But I can tell you that there will be teachers on the search committee as well as parents who will kind of share some of the values that I know that candidates will learn what's valued in this building through the process and through the questions. So, but I appreciate that question. Go ahead.
Danny.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of dovetailing on that
Yeah.
question then is, if Mark's not going to be involved in the process, which I understand, I'm curious about the job description itself. How much is templated versus how much is actually sought by the community here to inform what that job description should look like? My thinking is that we have a very strong and successful culture here.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how much that's going to be actually documented so that the SAC can actually say, hey, this is a great candidate.
Yeah.
On paper, they're great, but they're not going to fit with our culture because it's been defined on these criteria on this job description.
That's a really good question. So what I'm going to show in a little bit at the end, and I totally appreciate that question, is a survey that we're going to do in the Mason Rice community to get as much information as possible. So we're going to do a survey to document everything you're saying. So how do you, one way to document culture, there are a range of ways to do that. One of them is to get as much information as possible. So we're going to send this survey out to the entire Mason Rice community, and that includes faculty as well, which is what's working really well right now, and have that documented. And then what are areas that you believe deserve the attention of the new principal, and what qualities and attributes are you looking for in a principal? And this information will be shared both as we think about interview questions, and then there's the whole aspect of once somebody's on board, how do they know this? You know, so for example, it'll be really interesting to look at that first question about what's working well at Mason Rice right now. And I think whoever gets hired would want to pay a lot of attention to the answers to that first question, because the last thing you want to do is, if something's working well, is mess with it early on in your tenure. And believe it or not, there are people in every organization who sometimes try to do that to make their mark. And so this will be really, really important. And we're going to do this by grade level, how long you've been at Mason Rice. We'll have some questions on top to even triangulate that data more, and then use this for questions. So helpful. Yes, in the back.
One principle that is going to be under. So if only one principal is going to be on the SAC and it's not, unfortunately, going to be Mark Springer, how do we make sure it's a principal that has maintained at their elementary school the culture that Mark maintains here? Who selects that principal? And
Yeah.
you know, there's a wide variety of cultures at the 14 schools.
Sure.
How do we make sure it's one that mirrors
Yeah.
Rice's culture?
So a couple things about that. You know, we always try to pay attention, find the right match to work as a group with a principal. But keep in mind, the principal is not, so A, we want to find a principal we think will work well with the community here. But keep in mind, that's just the first round of the interviews. That principal is not involved generally in the semi-finalist round or in the finalist round. And so that, I would look at the principal as one person of a group of 10 that will ask questions about leadership, how well they work with colleagues, and all of that. So we'll try to find a principal that people at Mason Rice will enjoy working with and value and respect, but that principal will not be involved kind of the whole way through. So it's a piece. Go ahead, then we'll go to the other side of the room.
How much emphasis do you put on, or importance in the past, of prior experience either in the Newton school system or here in Mason Rice?
Prior experience working in the Newton school system? You know, it's interesting.
In the school itself, here.
In the school itself?
Yeah.
In terms of the Newton school system, we've only hired one principal, I would say, not one or two, because all of our principals usually have been either principals or assistant principals. Until 3 years ago, Newton didn't have elementary assistant principals. So almost all elementary principals who come to work at Newton come from outside Newton. I can only think of, in the last 6 years, one who came from inside Newton. We had Mark Nardelli, who's the Brown Middle School principal, who's the Horace Mann principal, came from Brown Middle School as an assistant principal. Everybody else hired in the last 6 years came from outside Newton. And we had a principal, Diana Beck, who's at Zervis, who worked in Newton, left and became a principal, and then came back. That's about the only case I can think of. But most, because we generally want to hire people with leadership experience. This is a school of almost 500 kids. I can't imagine hiring somebody with no leadership experience. And if I was to ask the faculty, this came up the other day, under no circumstances does the faculty want to hire somebody at Mason Rice who has no leadership experience. They were really clear about that. That would just make them too anxious. They were thinking, to have somebody who has 26 years as a principal experience and then go to somebody who has no even leadership experience, that's a risk that I wouldn't feel comfortable taking. But on the other hand, we're not going to hire somebody with 26 years experience. That's probably not going to happen. They may have 26 years of professional experience, but not as a leader. So the answer is we want to find the best person, and they can come from a range of schools or school districts. The question is, how well do they learn, and how well do they listen? Listening and learning is so essential. I always worry about people who say, I want to hit the ground running. Because I don't necessarily want someone who's going to hit the ground running, because sometimes they run too fast and run over people. So I actually don't want that. I think in this culture, it's somebody who can hit the ground listening and hit the ground learning. And then we'll just go across. Go ahead, and then we'll move across.
How much weight do the parents and faculty have in terms of input and use of that input in the final decision? So I understand that there's this group that will be interviewing and facilitating the process, but at the end of that process, how much of that input is taken on board? Yeah,
so we collect input all the way through. There's one part of input that I want to build on that I didn't talk as much about, and that's the reference checking. That is so important. I can't tell you that we have had candidates who have done incredibly well through an interview process sometimes in my career, and I'm sure for some of you. And then you get down to the end, and you talk to 8 people they've worked with, and there's this hesitancy about, will you necessarily hire this person again? And there's a pause. Or can we do better? And there's this pause. And you just know it when you feel it. I see some of you nodding, and it becomes, have you experienced that, Michael? Somebody, big time. All right, that's good. I'm getting, so that becomes really important as well. So I like to think that we triangulate our data, and what hopefully happens is that their performance and experience during the interview process matches their past experience in leadership, and that becomes critical. So oftentimes, it's interesting, I usually think that the parent perspective and the faculty perspective is pretty similar. Not always. We have had experience where different stakeholder groups react differently to candidates, and sometimes even within groups. I had something a few years ago where the faculty actually didn't agree on a candidate, and to me that was a good sign of a school where people felt comfortable sharing different perspectives. But it matters a lot. At the end of the day, sometimes these are really close calls, and hopefully we have 2 candidates left and we're deciding, going back and forth. Usually it's pretty clear that there's consensus among all stakeholder groups. But the answer is stakeholder groups matter a lot. Because I think at the end of the day, it gets challenging to come in as a new person when multiple stakeholder groups don't necessarily think you're the best person. I've seen that happen before, where it's a close call and we have information and others don't, but usually people see it the same way. But again, those references become critical towards the end. I also, we also now, when somebody gives me a reference list of 4 people and say these are my references, I almost never call the people on the list because I've never gotten a bad reference that somebody's given me. You know what it is? We call people that aren't on reference lists, call them out of the blue. You've worked with this person, because that really is much more meaningful. The person that isn't on your reference list. So we try to do all of that. Does that answer your question? I hope that it's.
Yeah.
I think it matters a lot. And actually, the nice thing is that there's a chance for parents to see candidates in two different ways. Early on, which is the screening, and then the finalist candidates as well, both in small groups and in larger groups. So let's keep going across. Jump in.
Hi there. Thank you. I'm Kimberly Clydeman Jackson. I actually wrote you an email on Friday, and you're
Sure.
hitting all the points that I had raised, so I really appreciate it, and it sounds like a very thoughtful, excellent search, particularly those references. And if this survey work is going to define both the interview questions and the things you ask references, then I feel very comfortable with that. I had a question, I'm sure this is also, you've thought about this, but I had a question about how you work diversity into the search. In the corporate world that I'm familiar with, there's often a special effort made now to make sure that a short list includes diverse candidates, and sometimes not just diverse, which can be, could lead to tokenism, but in particular to include African American candidates who often are neglected in a general diversity. So I would say, please, if we can, make sure we have diverse and African American candidates.
Yeah, I'm glad that's something that, one of the first things when we talk with the Selection Advisory Committee, it's that very topic, is that how do we reach far as we think about candidates and who we're screening, because we may give the group 12 candidates and say choose 8, and really to look for a diverse range of experiences, backgrounds, and that it's a real priority to do that. So I'm glad you raised that, Kimberly. That's something that our HR department talks about. And we have a kind of a diversity recruiting group right now. It's right in front of our website, and it's really important, and that's something we'll highlight. So thanks for your email. I'm glad I hit the points, and you just raised in one that we talk more about with that group. So thank you. Hi.
When you were talking about bringing, in particular, the part where the finalists will be coming to Mason Rice and spending the day and such, and meeting with parents and teachers and et cetera, I didn't hear you speak at all about the stakeholder of the children.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how important it is in what you're weighing for teaching experience before becoming an educational leader, and how you're going to assess the way that the candidates interact with the kids who are the most important.
Yeah, so when I was talking about visiting schools in the semi-finalist round, well, our questions are about, what did you see the teacher doing? It's really what did you see the children doing, too? And so we watch them in the semi-finalist round in schools. I'm glad you raised that. I should have kind of highlighted when we visit schools, it's also seeing what the kids are doing. And we even watch kind of how they interact with children when they visit schools. We have seen a few people do that in a way that we wouldn't want a principal to do that. And so it is important about how do you, for example, if we have somebody who is 6'3", like me, visit an elementary school classroom, and they walk in and they start talking to children like this, that is not good. When I visit elementary schools, I like to think myself as a baseball catcher, and I spend the entire day like this. And I literally know how catchers are so tired when they're over 35 and why they can't catch. Because I can't move at the end of visiting a preschool or elementary school, and I'm going to just stay like this to test and see how many innings I can do. But that's the kind of thing you need eye contact with kids straight on, and that becomes really important. In terms of teaching experience, that's really important as well. I mean, I talked to somebody else, we were talking before about somebody else had a question about past leadership experience, but we should probably combine that with teaching experience as well. And one way to assess that is when they visit classrooms, how knowledgeable are they? And what do they look for? But being knowledgeable about teaching, and also as a principal, there are so many changes in education. It's being a learner as you go all the way through too, because our teachers are always learning, and our leaders need to be learning with principals. So I don't want to necessarily name a number, but I think somebody who's really passionate about teaching understands the role of teachers in the incredibly challenging work of teaching. Somebody who's not afraid to teach themselves, like during guided reading, take a group. And we have often our principals do lots of teaching themselves, and that's something that is really important. Whether we ask somebody to do that during the process, I don't know. Sometimes we ask them to give a presentation, but that's kind of an interesting thought. How would you prepare something if you were to teach a small group? It gets back to that authentic task issue. But we'll watch them all the way, you know, how they relate to kids are really important. Again, that's something we should be asking during reference checks as well. How much time do they spend in classrooms? A principal would not be successful at Mason Rice if they're an office principal. That would not work well. I don't think that should work well at any school, in particular in this culture. The person should be kind of out all day, and we want to get a sense from the people they work with. How often do you see the principal during the week in your classroom? You can kind of ask that to kids, see what they say. Ask that to teachers, see what they say. Those are good questions. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that some of the possible issues with the timeline include if they're finalists in multiple appointments.
Districts, yeah.
So as far as our search committee for Mason Rice, is it specifically for Mason Rice versus the Newton North, and are they separate candidates? Because I think that there's definitely a very different feel from elementary school to high school, and how many other jobs are you possibly looking for right now as a superintendent for the Newton Public Schools? Yeah,
good question. So I don't anticipate that we will have the same candidates for Mason Rice and Newton North. That, you know, usually people don't have, sometimes we have people of elementary and high school, so that we don't have to worry about. The other issue is we have 3 elementary school vacancies, principal vacancies right now. So we have Franklin, which is kind of already underway because they have an interim, and that's moving into, so they started first. And then Memorial Spalding is basically in the same timeline as Mason Rice. It's maybe 5 or 6 days later. So the Franklin search is kind of separate because that's kind of already underway and they're meeting. So Mason Rice and Franklin, this came up the other day with the faculty, and I would say for the most part, we may have some overlap with candidates for those 2 jobs. They're both 2 of our larger elementary schools. I would also say that sometimes a candidate's a better fit for one than the other. So to say to candidates who apply to us, you go to the Mason Rice pool, you go to the Memorial Spalding pool, my instinct is not to do that. I will tell you, I did have an experience, not in Newton, where we had 2 schools who had a tug-of-war over the candidates. It happened in my district in New York, and that's awkward. That was awkward, to say the least. And I'm willing to take the risk. The only other way to do that is not to say to a candidate, I'm sorry, you can't go to Mason Rice, you're only going to Spalding, and that would have been more awkward. So we have to kind of work with each other as partners and figure out how to make it work.
And each school has their own committee.
Each school has their own committee. That is really important. We're not going to do any kind of shared hiring at all. I think the question before about culture and questions, I don't think that's a good idea. So we're going to keep it separate. Over there in the back, and then we'll jump back.
Hi, my name is Levy. Since Mark was hired, the big sea change has been No Child Left Behind and test scores. And Mason Rice is a particular problem, having such good test scores, and yet a culture that doesn't emphasize them. From the district point of view, what's a good answer from a principal candidate about test scores, and what's a problematic answer?
Number one, I just want to say that's a really good question. And it's a trick question for candidates, too. So I actually like trick questions because it kind of, you're testing my judgment right now. So, because it's really interesting. No, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's so hard to say testing's bad. So if I'm running for president, right? If I'm, Hillary or Mark, if you walk in there or Marco Rubio and say, I'm against testing, that's the problem is, challenge of saying that is, for most of our country, that means you're for low standards. What do you mean you're against testing? Yet we know, and I've been to Finland, they're not a heavy testing country. They're doing really well on tests because they value some of the things that Mason Rice values in terms of the whole child and social and emotional development and all of that. So I think that if we were to hire a new principal at Mason Rice, and it's really important to use data and understand, there's lots of assessment and testing at Mason Rice every day, but it happens to be formative assessments that help teachers in the day-to-day work with kids, as opposed to the high-stakes testing, which is what you're asking about MCAS or PARC. If we hire somebody in here who says, I'm going to come into Mason Rice because my goal is to raise test scores, that's probably not the best match, in terms of, on the other hand, if we had a school that all of a sudden the test scores dropped a lot, that would be a cause for concern. But I know this community values a lot more than just test scores. So the answer is, I would say test scores are one component to assess a school, but there are so many other measures. Do kids love going to school every day? Do parents see progress in whatever need the child has? How well does the school serve all kids, not just kids where learning maybe comes more easily than other kids? So how do they work with kids with different kinds of challenges, whether they be academic or emotional? So the answer is it's one component among many. That's what I would hope a candidate would say.
If a good candidate or an adequate candidate is not identified along this timeline, and we do end up with an interim principal, how is that process? Who would that be? What influence do parents or faculty have in terms of that? Because I know that in several Newton public schools, they've ended up with interim principals for a year, and sometimes it's another year, and sometimes they switch from one year to the next, and there have been challenges in some of the schools finding adequate principalship.
Yeah, so did everybody hear the question back there? Yes. So the answer is this. If we don't find somebody who, and remember, we're not going to find every candidate we hire, there's no perfect candidate, but we want to find somebody who has incredible potential as well. And that's really important. We would find an interim principal if we don't find somebody that will work. The other thing we have to think about is, when do we do that? Because maybe at my kids' school they didn't find somebody, and then they re-advertised, and in May a terrific candidate came about, so we might be able to go back out and look. That's the first answer. And then we would find an interim. And we typically want to have interims who are experienced, who ideally have worked in Newton before. That makes it easier, because then you're not, to have an interim principal to come in for a year who doesn't know the system can put great challenges, in particular on the staff, because they don't know structures or how things work. So we would try to find somebody as soon as possible, and that's something that we do on our side. We don't have an extensive interview process, because frankly, most good interims are usually retired, and they're not, they don't participate in an interview process. But that being said, we would love to choose somebody who's sometimes even known to the people here in the building. That's why it works much better as well. If we can say we have an interim, and you all know that interim, that gives the faculty and staff a sense of relief, especially if they're highly regarded, and the interims we choose are highly regarded. So for example, we have an interim at Franklin right now, and if you would ask the staff, she's really well respected, and she was at Countryside before. I don't know that she's going to be able to be an interim again, but it's finding somebody who's really a skilled and experienced leader. The job of the interim also is to keep the school moving, not make major change, and make sure that the person after can be successful. But we really want somebody who's experienced if they're going to be an interim, so they can keep the school moving. Somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. Jump in.
Hi, we talked a lot about the search process. What about the transition process?
Yeah.
Both for a full-time principal as well as the potential or likelihood of an interim. What support or requirements are provided by the district? What can the school community itself provide? And what other parents or community members can be involved in that to make sure it is smooth, that our culture is
so important, because the hiring process is the easy part. Helping the person to be successful is the next stage. So the first part I would say is, all the survey data we talked about, that is like a binder, and all we learned during the search process, really beginning today and with the faculty and conversations, that's really not information just for hiring, but it's really, those first two questions are really about helping the next person. in terms of what to focus on. And then when I talked before about listening and learning, that person would start July 1st. Whoever we hire most likely will be employed somewhere else, so they will not be here a lot before July 1st for a variety of reasons. Also, you know, I think when you're leaving a building and you've been here for 21 years, you want to be able to finish up and feel like you're still the principal. So there won't be extensive amounts of public overlap per se, but we tend to have late meetings late in the afternoon between the departing principal and the person coming in. There can be a couple of meetings during the school year, but then it's really doing a thorough entry plan about learning more about Mason Rice beginning over the summer, individual meetings with faculty teams, and then with parents. Lots of meetings at the start of the year about what's working well, additional support. I mean, it's really a collective effort to make a new principal successful. That involves all of you. It involves us as much as possible. This is what we learned. And when we see, you know, potential landmines, to let them know as soon as possible what those are. I hope we hire somebody who's really open to feedback. That's something I've learned more and more about, that when we hire people that don't take feedback well in general, that makes me so nervous. Because at the end of the day, if you don't take feedback, the chances of you improving in whatever job you're in are not good. And so it's not only being able to give people feedback, but learning to take feedback. And that'll start kind of early in the process, so that we want somebody 6 months in, you know, to know how they're doing, and that'll involve getting feedback from all of you and going forward. So,
just
go ahead.
A quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I didn't hear any parental involvement during that summer before the school year actually begins.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Is that a possibility?
Yes, I would anticipate.
Have a second group potentially, maybe some overlap, but even
Yeah, I would anticipate meetings with parents over the summer. So I would encourage a new candidate to do, if they can do some parent meetings over the summer, whether it's a parent welcome, whether it's a small group that the PTO puts together of leaders so they can begin some work over the summer. I would see that over the summer. Yeah, as well. I mean, some people aren't here over the summer, but to get a structured group that represents the community, I think as much can be done over the summer because, you know, once September starts, the person's so busy. So as much kind of pre-work in terms of what I talked before about the listening and the learning, slow down on the doing. If somebody comes in here and says, here's my playbook, this is what I do, you know, that makes me nervous. The playbook has to be developed with input from lots of people, and slow down on the playbook in the first year. The first year is about building trustful and relationships with faculty and staff and families. If you can build trustful and begin to build trust and confidence, then if you want to start something new or make one minor change, it's a lot easier if you have the trust and confidence first. So, anybody, we'll go to people who haven't asked questions, and then we'll...
Just a super quick question.
Sure.
How do we go about nominating a parent for the selection committee?
Yeah, so we talked to the PTO about having parent representatives that represent the diversity of the school in all kinds of ways. So that's something we talked to the process with the PTO about. We don't get involved. From our end, if we were getting involved in choosing parents, that... PTO, yeah, it's tricky for us.
Following this meeting, we need to figure out what that process is. We didn't have as much information, so we've gotten more today too. So Franklin, for example, has had people do an application to be part of the selection advisory committee, and then we'll have a group from the PTO actually reviewing those applications and deciding. I think the biggest thing is that there will be multiple touch points, so that with 3 people, it doesn't seem like a lot for all of us. 3 people who well represent the community as a whole, and then there'll be other times, whether it's a small focus group or the larger group meeting, that everyone will have an opportunity to engage on the candidate as well. So.
And then there's also that finalist day, where in addition to the large group, you can have 5 or 6 parents sit around the finalists. And so that's another great opportunity to participate. And that's more informal as opposed to structured questions. Somebody else had a hand. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my question has to do with the, what you described as sort of big changes, little changes.
There's been some talk about the possibility of an assistant principal being introduced along the way. That would be a big change, and I haven't heard anything about that here. How does that fit into the picture going forward?
Yeah, I wanted to, and that was only because I wanted to focus so much, there's so much to cover, and I wanted to get to questions. So in Newton, our schools that are larger than 450 have a half-time assistant principal. There's only, actually there's going to be 4, there's 3 now. And they have that person also does some direct service work around literacy intervention for the most part. So a couple years ago, Mason Rice, Mark had wanted to have additional psychologist time when we were giving additional time. So Jeff, this was like 3 years ago, so Jeff, our torture excellent psychologist, is now full-time, which is really important in a school this size. But Mason Rice has continued to get bigger, not smaller. I mean, it's amazing in the last 5 years, for those of you who have been here for a while, how much larger the school is. So the school really qualifies now for an assistant principal, and I think it's best if a new principal is involved in hiring an assistant principal. It can be very awkward. I experienced this once, where somebody right before they left hired an assistant principal, and we don't want to do that. So I think, you know, it's best that we finish the principal search process, and then you can also think about what kind of match would match the community and strengths and all that. So Mason Rice is not going to get any bigger. As a matter of fact, with Zervis in a year and a half will be done. That will give Mason Rice a little bit of breathing room. You all know there are only 3 fifth grade classes leaving, which means Mason Rice can only have 3 incoming kindergarten classes, and we want to keep those classes at reasonable size. And so we're going to try to get those, you know, with the lines changed for incoming Ks, we're going to try to keep the school reasonably small because of folks can go to Zervis. So the answer is that'll probably happen right after this process is done.
I had just one question, actually, a couple of observations that you hit on it. The first question I had was, are you planning to do any outreach? Do you have anyone in mind, or do you have communities into which you're going to tap into, knowing Mason Rice's culture, knowing the importance of recess to parents and children, knowing the importance of so many things that have been part and parcel of what we've all experienced here?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we have certain networks that we use for recruiting. For example, there's a program that's called ELI, which is a Leadership Institute, Educators Leadership Institute, where a lot of talented educators who want to be administrators go through that program. And we know the director of that program, and he tends to send us strong applicants. So it's really a handful of people who know who the good candidates who are out there. We also use some of our existing principals, are part of a lot of networks, you know, when you have a lot of leaders as well. So it's kind of a range of ways, but it's finding key people who tend to know people who are out there as much as possible. And then just hopefully we find that right person who the community feels is right, who we think has great potential as well. Because I use the word potential because not everybody has the whole package right away, but like in 3 years, who is going to be a great leader? And obviously we want to have somebody who has some track record of leadership, because the danger of not having any record of leadership is we don't know what we're getting. And so we want to find somebody who, what have they done in their current position to address issues of culture, to address kind of the balance that you're kind of talking about. That's what we want to do. So it's through the networks we use and figuring what else we can find. So.
My observation was, it struck me in talking through this, it's almost, and looking forward, this wouldn't affect our children because I think this is something that takes time. But without an assistant principal in place, and without somebody given that opportunity to develop the experience that you're emphasizing so much, it almost puts a school at a disadvantage when there is a leadership transition. So if Mason Rice, for example, had an assistant principal in place, that may have well helped with the transition. And just an observation thinking forward, as some of these schools are getting bigger, is it appropriate to be thinking about a different approach to that issue as schools have more needs and bigger populations?
The first thing is we have hired a principal and assistant principal at the same time. So just so you know, and it can work very well. When you think about a new principal and you just hired your assistant principal, there can be a great advantage to that. I can tell you that I've known principals that have stepped into a job and said to me, my biggest problem, I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about this happened to me in the past, my biggest problem is my assistant principal. You know, and so that can cut both ways. I think it can actually be a great advantage in terms of complementing each other. So I would say that cuts both ways. So I don't necessarily look at that as an institutional challenge. There'll be some challenges to it, but to have two people learning together can be incredibly exciting and invigorating. In terms of changes in support to our larger elementary schools, I think we want to make sure that we still staff appropriately in our larger elementary schools. For example, Mason Rice now has 1.5 literacy specialists, 1.5. Until 2 years ago, it only had 1, so it had the same number of literacy specialists as Ward. So I've changed all of that so that we staff up, so that larger elementary schools have kind of staffs that are proportional to the students. We're doing that both in administration and instructionally. And you know, for the most part, Mason Rice is pretty reasonable class sizes. We have the one, you know, grade with a very, very large group. But it's in the middle. It's better than it was 5 years ago for those of you who've been here, and it'll get better now with service. But we're always looking at structures and how to do better. Is the answer? Absolutely. I appreciate your question. Jump in.
I have a question.
That's okay. The microphone, what am I going to do?
Microphone, so I will talk.
Yeah, there's no way.
So Mark, as you well know, has a very good relationship with his teachers. Great. I mean, they were inspired by him, and I think he has a very strengths-based, view. I think there's different philosophies of management and leadership. For management, it's like you can be the critical manager and be focused on mostly feedback, or you can be focused on leverage your strengths, which I think is how he tends to approach it. And I'm just not sure how that aligns with how I think the time where you'd see that in a principal search is when you actually bring them to a different school and you have them review people. How much of it is focused on leveraging the strengths of those teachers in the conversation versus just having critical feedback? Because I think for us, and also with our kids, it's a lot, principal stars, it's about how can you achieve and what are the things you can leverage, but I think that's a core part of who we are as an organization, and so I just want to make sure that that's emphasized somewhere.
Yeah, so that's helpful. We spent a lot of time as a leadership group in thinking about feedback. I talked earlier about thinking about how to accept feedback, and that's really important, and then it's how to give feedback, and there's a lot of increasing research about how to give feedback. What we don't want to do is when we overwhelm people with feedback, we say, these are I was just in your classroom, and these are the 10 things you need to do better. We know that, that just doesn't work. However, these are the 1 or 2 things that would take this lesson to the next level. Or these are the 1 or 2 things as a principal in your leadership that would take it to the next level. That is important. And so I think being able to deliver feedback that's positive, but I look at it as that our job is to make people better. At the end of the day, right, in leadership in general or as teachers, we want to have our students who are better prepared for the future, and that's true for adults too, that it's how do you make people better, and what does that look like, and how does that come about during the interview process? So if we talk to a teacher who's in the school of a future candidate here, how did that principal make you better? I'm always struck by that. If I don't get anything, how did that principal make you more thoughtful, reflective? How did that principal help you support kids? Tell me about a teacher who you supported a lot, and what did your support look like? I think all of you can ask that. And that tells you a lot about what they value. And so I think stuff like that we can partially get from the interview process and partly from the reference process. That is really important to me, about how do they make people, support people to help them improve, because we all have things we can improve on. Okay, one thing that I need to improve on is being on time, and so I have to be at Newton North at 10. So but I can go 10 minutes.
If there's somebody who hasn't asked a question, I'm happy to.
Thanks. And this is a great test for finalist candidates, by the way. Lots of questions. How well do they handle lots of questions?
So I think the overwhelming theme here is a very active community and looking for the practicum. component, is there a way to make sure that this search process includes that more than just the questions, sit around a table interview? I think we all are very concerned about how will this person interact here in the community. One, knowing all of our kids' names. Obviously, it's a challenge to learn 100 new names a year, let alone nearly 500. But I think those are the themes. We come from a variety of backgrounds, or we know how to prepare for an interview if it's one day, multi-day, a week. But really seeing the involvement in the community, and I'm not sure that the process as it's outlined today truly addresses all of those things, especially when we're talking about all of the wonderful things Mark has implemented. More recess, less homework. And look, we have scores to support that. Making sure those things are really accounted for in this process, which might require a bit of a tweak to what's been laid out today.
Mm-hmm. I think every process we can be flexible. On the other hand, I would also ask what you raised, how can we get at some of those issues? Are not always easy, but past indication is sometimes the best bet in some ways. But we're open to being flexible in terms of what that looks like.
So are there questions presented on this survey that we have opportunities to comment on that so it can actually be looked at from a data perspective as to what we're looking for in the actual process?
Yeah, if you want to add, feel free to add in whatever way. If you have ideas on the finalist day especially, we'll have more flexibility. We could make some changes in the finalist day and do things that, would highlight some of the things you're interested in. Totally. I already joked about that 5:30 kind of, run. We can do more. We probably have time for one or two more.
My question's actually really brief. I just don't know all the background, but I know Mark has been very supportive of the after-school program. It's very vital to a lot of working parents. And I'm just wondering, is that something that would potentially change, or is that going to stay the way it is with a new principal? I'm not quite sure what the potential rental of space or whatnot.
Yeah, that's pretty standard. On the other hand, it does matter as an after-school program director, you want to have a principal that's supportive and that values after-school programs, so we want to make sure that somebody does. That would be important. All right. Wow, this will be a good test for these finalist candidates. So just keep doing what you're doing. But I'm actually serious, because I think that part of we want somebody who can stand up there and answer every last question and keep asking these really good questions. I also will tell you that you have total flexibility in what you ask as a selection advisory committee, and also small groups of parents on the finalist day. Some of your questions about how do we gauge this, those are your opportunities to kind of think about how you want to do that as a community. And so we can figure out how to get at some of this, and we'll kind of rethink what we do based on what we heard today. So I think this is about communication with all of you. It's about a partnership. It's about listening to your very constructive feedback. So thank you all very much.
And the PTO co-presidents have been in very close contact on this process. It's obviously the most important thing we can do this year to make sure that we have a great new principal coming in. But feel free to email us at masonracepto@gmail.com. I usually answer it and make sure that I include Carol Ann and Sarah in our replies, so one of us will get back to you as well if there's additional follow-up. But this is incredibly important to make sure that we're all engaged in the process, and we'll continue to keep the lines of communication open. But please, any questions, concerns, feel free to forward them to us, because we will make sure that we get it addressed.
Thank you all so much, and we all look forward to working with you.
Thank you.